So it's a pleasure to start this session about nation, historical roots of extremist narratives and nation with the conference of Alejandro Quiroga titled Nationalism and Populism in Europe, Then and Now. Alejandro Quiroga Fernández de Soto is Professor Titular of the Complutense University of Madrid. Is also a reader in Spanish history at the Newcastle University in the UK. He was teaching in the last years, in the last 20 years, in different universities in the United Kingdom as the Royal Holloway, the University of Nottingham, the London School of Economics, or the King's College of London. Nowadays he's also in the Complutense University of Madrid, director of the Master in Nationalism Studies. Well, his works focus on the study of nationalism and national identities in the 20th and 21st century in Spain mostly, but also in Europe. Most in general. Between the different publications, there's a lot of works of Alejandro Quiroga, but I want to mention some books: The Reinvention of Spain, Nation and Identity Since Democracy, with Sebastián Balfour, published in 2007. In the same year, also we have in English, Making Spaniards, Primo de Rivera and the Nationalization of Masses, 1923-1930. And then in the last 10 years, Football and National Identities in Spain, that was published also in Spanish. All this book you can find also published in Spanish. And recently, 2022, Miguel Primo de Rivera, Dictadura, Populismo y Nación, that is the first maybe biography of Miguel Primo de Rivera and complete study of the dictatorship of Miguel Primo de Rivera in the 20s in Spain. We will have in a few months, so next year, also the English edition of this book. So I give you the floor, Alex, and listen to you about nationalism, populism, then and now.
Okay, well, I do have a confession to make, which is that when Stephen Forti invited me to give this lecture, I wasn't really thrilled. I thought it wasn't really my field. After all, I've done more sort of interwar Europe than the contemporary stuff. But I soon realized that actually, well, it gave me the opportunity to reflect on what is surely one of the most important issues in today's world, the rise of the far right and the threat to democracy in Europe. But it also gave me the chance to reflect on the usefulness and the limitations of historical analysis. So this is a way to thank you for the invitation. In this lecture, what I would like to do is to draw some comparisons on the role of nationalist movements of the right in interwar Europe with current nationalist movements of the 2010s and 2020s, because it has become somehow commonplace nowadays to refer to interwar Europe as a point of reference to understand the current rise of the far right parties and governments as well. And there are a number of debates that I'm sure you're familiar with about the terminology, whether we can call these people fascists or not, or the similarities in the 20th century with the current movements, or obviously the use of propaganda has been a huge debate about the how different, how similar that is. My intention today is to examine these connections between the far-right movement and traditional conservatives, more sort of moderate conservatives, then in the interwar period and now. Because I think that by studying the connections, we can understand better how ideas circulate and how policies are implemented and how governments are formed in the wide ecosystem of the European right. Sometimes when we look at the far right, we tend to forget that these ideas, these people, and these policies actually operate in a wider, complex milieu in which the moderate and the traditional conservatives actually play a very central role. But then if we think about, I don't know, how Mussolini reached power and about his governments in the first years of the 1920s, then we'll see that the conservative ecosystem is really important there. And if we actually think about the governments that were formed in Italy in the late 1990s, or the government of Wolfgang Schulze in Austria with the Conservative Party in '99 and the incorporation of the far right of Jörg Haider, the Freedoms Party, then we can understand that that these connections and these exchanges in between the far right and the more traditional right, it's essential to to get sort of a grip of the phenomenon. As apologies. As for May 2024, May this year, what we had in Europe was 6 EU countries: Italy, Finland, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, and the Czech Republic, where the hard right was in government. And then in July, the incorporation of Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom into the Dutch government. We got another one there. And there are other countries, I'm thinking about Sweden, in which the hard right is not in government, but is actually supporting in parliament the current conservative government. In the following minutes, what I would like is to draw some similarities and differences between that far right in the interwar period and the far right today, but as well with this connection with the moderate conservatives in Europe. What I'm seeking here, what I'm trying to get at is to understand the precedents of the current situation and to understand the way in which liberal democracies are challenged by illiberal movements and regime. That said, I am a historian. That means that I'm very, very careful when drawing comparisons from 100 years ago, because people 100 years ago were almost from a different planet. So this is a very risky business. And what I'm going to try to do, or at least to keep this in mind, is that we have to contextualize these very different historical moments, and we have to historicize, as ever, the actual elements that we're comparing here. So a contextualization historically of the elements and as well of the conclusions. Okay, let's go then. At the risk of stating the obvious, the main similarity that we may come across is that the nation is at the very center of all far-right and conservative movements of interwar Europe, in the very same manner that it is of the traditional and far-right conservative movements of the 21st century. So both in the 1920s and the 1930s, they're going to put the nation at the very center of their political discourses, but as well of their policies. As we know, there can be sort of, nationalism and populism together, but there cannot be actually populism without nationalism. So nationalism, it doesn't actually require populism, but nationalism. Sorry, but populism actually requires nationalism at the very center. What I think is important here is that about the centrality of the nation is that it allowed extremist and moderate conservatives alike to idealize national equality, which is usually an ethnic equality, in the search for this homogeneous society that we perfectly know never existed. And actually, this focus on national equality, this search for this homogeneity, what actually allows and allowed in the 1920s and the 1930s to actively ignore social and political equality. And this is something that in yesterday's talk came in a couple of occasions, the idea of equality. So the political equality and the collective rights guaranteed by a democratic system were usually of little concern of the far right and many conservatives in the 1920s and 30s. And now, in the very same manner, the current movement idealize this national equality, which again usually is mainly an ethnic equality, in the search for this, yet again, national society that never existed. And likewise, the political equality and the collective rights, say, for instance, trade union rights, are usually ignored or of a not of a great concern for these groups. The other main element which I have found similar is the populist leaders of the sort of leadership in the 1920s and in the 1930s of the far-right movements. And we have a huge literature here from the classic works of Arno Meyer and his dynamics of counter-revolution, Martin Blinkhorn's Fascism and the Right, or recently Marco Bresciani, Conservatives and Right Radicals in Interwar Europe. And they all describe these populist leaders in a very uncanny, similar manner to the populist leaders of our days. The leaders of the far right in the interwar period, they gave or created the impression that they were seeking for fundamental changes in government, society, and community. But in reality, they relied pretty much on patronage and of this actually incumbent elite to gain power. So they never sought for real change in, at least in terms of class, in terms of social change. Actually, what happened was that they shored up, they reinforced this class and property relations. So a lot of militant rhetoric, but very little of actual social change, and very little economic substance. So this is, in many respects, the case of Mussolini, but it is as well of many dictators, like Primo de Rivera in the case of Spain in the 1920s, or Horthy, Admiral Horthy in the case of Hungary, or Pilsudski in the case of Poland, right? Arno Meyer also explains how right-wing populists in the interwar period actually expose and overstate these cracks in a crisis-torn society, especially in the 1930s. But they were unable to account for them in any sensible and coherent manner. What they actually did was to direct the anger of part of the population from the genuine elites and move them towards fictional conspiracies and minorities. So what they were blaming, the Jews or the ethnic minorities within the state, Freemasons, or left-wingers of all sorts. The idea is that these help pretty much to salvage, in many respects, individuals' self-esteem by actually directing them towards a plot, towards a conspiracy that would actually explain the situation or the context in which these individuals were actually living. There were as well in the 1920s and the 1930s systematic attacks on science, systematic attacks on Enlightenment thought, obviously, and the use of political lies as true elements that actually could explain the changes in the political situations. In this case, Federico Finkelstein, A Brief History of Fascist Lies, it's a very good example of the use of lies as political weapons, but as well as something that is properly believed by those behind these behind the production and the reception of those lies. So basically what I'm saying here is that three factors: the unwillingness to transform the socioeconomic structure, the enemy within, and the widespread use of lies. They're all, very common elements nowadays in the hard right, but as well in many sectors of the moderate right. And when we think about patronage as well, if we think about Rupert Murdoch or Elon Musk or Paul Marshall, or the many billionaires funders of right-wing groups, there is actually here a very clear lack of desire to change the socio-economic structures. It is, and if we think about campaigns against Muslims or blacks or brown people or left-wingers, yet again, is the very idea of the enemy within functioning here. I don't have to say anything about lies. I don't have to say anything about fake news. Now, there are as well, and I think this is very important, very significant disparities between this 1920s and 30s hard right and the current hard right. The reverse of in many respects, the reverse side of the enemy within is this idea of the myth of national homogeneity, this idea of the national rebirth. And in the 1930s and the 1940s as well, the idea that territorial integrity had to somehow to match with ethnic integrity of the nation was obviously, as you know, one of the main factors that drove war, and especially the Nazi campaign of war, trying to somehow fit the ethnic with the territorial integrity. Nowadays, I think imperialism, war, and ethnic cleansing is not on the cards, although there are talk about mass migrations and mass deportations. Has emerged very, very recently. But usually, hard right parties are not appealing for war as such. It's not something that is on the cards. Perhaps with the current exception of Russia, but that's something probably different. The idea that immigration, which is at the very center of this new political discourse, is something that is destroying the homogeneity of the nation. It's crucial here, and this is something that, as you know, became a very strong part of the conservative discourse and policies as well, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall. This came hand in hand with the destruction, or at least not destruction, but the erosion, the undermining of the anti-fascist master narratives that was actually part, or at the very center as well, of most national discourses all the way up till 1989, and afterwards it became to be somehow undermined. In Eastern Europe, partly by equating fascism to communism as similar evils, and in some cases presenting communism as wars as fascism, in the most dramatic cases, as in the case of Yugoslavia, when some of the sides, or some of the fighters in that conflict actually reclaim their fascist past. As I was thinking about the Ustasha in the case of the Croat militia, in which in this case, you know, it was obvious that the link, and it was proudly proclaimed. In Western Europe, the situation was somehow different, but the undermining of these anti-fascist master narratives that actually were at the core were somehow foundational myths of the nations, whether British or French or Italian. This erosion of the anti-fascist master narratives actually, I think, came in different manners. In the case of Italy, usually by presenting fascism as something not as bad, something not as cruel as Nazism, and as well as presenting Italians as somehow the victims of those of the German occupation forces. And in the case of Austria, the recipe was quite similar. Austrians were usually presented as the victim by some conservative historiography, not by all historiography, but the most conservative historiography presented Austrians as victims of the Nazis. The people had been occupied, and they had very little to do. And I don't think it's by chance that the first government that actually incorporated far-right parties were actually Italy in the 1990s and Austria in 1999, because that anti-fascist myth had been eroded quite rapidly after the fall of the Berlin Wall. There are other places like Spain in which the anti-fascist myth, well, just didn't exist for obvious reasons. Of course, that the duration of the Franco dictatorship well into almost the end of the Cold War, into the mid-70s, and as well because of the way this transition to democracy was done, that is, by incorporating Francoist elites into the democratic political system. That meant that, you know, the current foundational myth of the nation, it was for many years that the transition to democracy, but it couldn't be as such an anti-fascist myth by definition. So in that sense, in the case of Spain, not in the case of Portugal, but certainly in the case of Spain, that wasn't possible to have an anti-fascist myth. Now, the gradual undermining of this anti-fascist consensus, which, by the way, was also a consensus about the welfare state. The far right began with this undermining to have more and more influence, and I'm thinking about a book that was published already in the late 1980s by a sociologist called Brigitte Orphalie, and it's called L'adhésion au Front National, and she already saw how the Front National in the case of France had very little electoral support, but at a discursive level, those policies were gradually taken as their own policies by the French right, and eventually actually by the Socialist Party and even the Communist Party to a lesser extent. But so in that respect, the situation is similar to the far right or the far right in France in the 1930s. Where they had more political weight than electoral weight, and they were able to put a lot of pressure on French government, including the Front Populaire of 1936. So in many respects, what we have there is a hard right that was punching above their political electoral weight and having an influence already. Then, and in the case of the UK, with UKIP, the current Reform Party, obviously, it's very, very clear how those ideas, the anti-European Union ideas, became mainstream. I don't have to go through that, but I think that the process of the normalization of the far right, this sort of naturalization and this sort of xenophobia, which was something that Kaz Moody actually mentioned in 20 in 2019 in the far right today, I think it is, this idea that this fourth wave of extremism of the far right, you would say, now increasingly are portrayed as the voice of the common sense. Instead of being misled or guided, well, that was actually what happened before. So I would like to reflect on this sort of common sense, what is going on, what's been going on for a number of years. Because turning the populist far right into the voice of common sense implies a dehumanization of foreigners in general, of refugees in particular, and it does also imply a good deal of what is being called the politics of cruelty, by implementing a number of policies and passing legislation against migrants and also against the lowest strata of society. So the idea that the poor can be actually excluded from the nation is something that has been, I would argue, implemented in recent years. So I would like to actually to focus on those policies. There are somehow some very obvious cases, like this image that you have there is a van that was going around the country, not just one van, but a number of vans that were going around the UK in 2015, 2016. This was an idea of the Home Office Minister of the UK, Theresa May, under the Conservative government. So this cruelty, this idea that one could promote this sort of policy, and it was fine, it was common sense, that was promoted by a Conservative government, is a very, very obvious example of how those ideas of the far right are actually taken, assumed by Conservative governments. Now, I would like to, I'm going to give you two examples of two different policies by Conservative governments, which I think help to explain this process of normalization of the far right. Now, the interesting thing about these policies, unlike this one, which is very obvious, is that first, they were not presented as a reaction to the demands of the far right. As a matter of fact, the far right had no political representation in parliament in these two countries that I'm going to be talking about. One is Britain, precisely, in 2015. The other one is Spain in 2012. We know that the potential voters of the far right at the time voted for conservative parties. That was assumed. And then the third factor here is that these were policies that were implemented as austerity measures during the Great Recession of 2008. What I'm arguing here is that these policies were actually punitive policies that excluded migrants and poor nationals from the national community, and thus contributed to the normalization of the far-right ideas. Okay, so the first one that I would like to talk about is apologies. Is the March 2012 health reform passed by Spain's People's Party, the Partido Popular of Mariano Rajoy. Okay. So in practice, the legislation abolished Spain's universal health system, a system that guarantees access to free treatments to everyone living in Spain, regardless of their origin and legal status. The 2012 legislation not only excluded migrants from the health system, it also excluded unemployed Spaniards and Spanish migrants abroad. Just to contextualize the situation, in 2012, the years of the Great Recession, 26% of Spaniards were unemployed. The population of Spaniards that had left the country to a European Union country was of over 600,000. So this is a big exclusion of actually the lowest classes or the poorest sections of society. So by excluding irregular immigrants and unemployed Spaniards from the National Health Service, the conservative government was actually stripping poor foreigners and poor Spaniards from their health rights. Health rights that were actually to be guaranteed by the nation state. So in effect, what happened was that they were excluded from the national community. If the nation state with the welfare system was actually something to be protected by the state, by excluding these poor people and these irregular migrants, what the government was doing actually was taking these people out of the national community. It did have another, perhaps unintended impact here, which was that the so-called welfare nationalism or social patriotism, so this identity based on the pride to belong to a nation state that seeks to redistribute wealth, that seeks to protect all citizens under the umbrella of the welfare state, the state actually diminished. So there was a process of denationalization that essentially Spaniards, left-wing Spaniards, mainly felt less attached to that nation state because that nation state were actually excluding or breaking that welfare of the state. So in that sense, the attachment towards, and their status showing this, the attachment towards the nation actually, or the Spanish nation actually diminished those years. So the effects of these policies of austerity were actually twofold. First, it promoted the exclusion of the poor and foreigners as a common sense. But secondly, it also denationalized the left by targeting the basis of welfare nationalism. The second policy I would like to talk about is the so-called two-child benefit cap in the UK. Again, this was announced by the British government in 2015, and it was part of David Cameron's austerity measures. It meant that while parents can claim child tax credit, what is called their universal credit payments, the benefit, for their first and second child, they couldn't make these claims for any further children that they had. So yet again, this measure was presented as common sense in a time of economic crisis by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, himself the fourth child of a very rich family, and it's thought of clear deterrence for poor people not to have more children. I mean, it's very obvious. And here again, so the poor are, which actually happen to be, in many cases, of foreign descent as well. Not always, but often, were actually excluded from the national community. That came together hand in hand with virulent cuts in the British public sector and the long-term process of privatization of the public sector in the UK. So the idea again here is that the punishment of foreigners and poor people is somehow normalized. And then the following years, we came across a number of opinion polls and research studies that showed things that were going in that direction. So in 2017, an investigation by Aurora Humanitarian Initiative revealed that 56% of Britons considered that ethnic minorities were a threat to the nation. That very same year, an opinion poll showed that a majority of Britons, 55 in this case, opposed a unilateral guarantee for European Union citizens living in the UK. I know very well this because I was living in the UK at the time. So I guess what I'm arguing here is that those measures implemented during the economic crisis of 2008 to increase basically nationalist feelings among certain sectors of the population, but as well attack democratic rights, were somehow similar to what happened in a time of crisis in 1929. But whereas in the case of the Wall Street crash, eventually most governments ended up investing and in public / state elements to build or rebuild the state. As you know, the recipes were much more neoliberal in the case of the 2008 crisis. So even if the right and the far right sometimes, not always, but sometimes they champion the working class, their actual policies, they tend to exclude them. And in this case, nationalism is very, very clearly used as an ideological compensation device for a very material economic shortcomings. Nationalism is also a compensation device for what is a very real loss of actual rights. So this turning the unacceptable in acceptable, the changes in the Overton window that Subirats was mentioning yesterday, have been sort of mediated by long-term neoliberal policies and mid-term austerity measures. In the past, it was about revolution. In the past, the threat was, and it was real in the sense that it existed, the Russian Revolution and the revolutionary processes after the First World War throughout Europe. In this case, is the actual function of the neoliberal system, I think, its response to the crisis and its attack to the welfare state that has allowed the current batch of populist movements to succeed. And this has happened as well, as you know, at the European Union level. Leanings, to be polite, when the far right attack an asylum center, or the police or border security forces are violent towards minorities, is the norm. The dehumanization of black and brown migrants and Muslims is repeatedly denounced by human rights organizations of the very European Union. I mean, everybody knows that the Tunisian police constantly, systematically rape women and children in Tunisia. And that police is paid by the European Union and the Italian government. So that's it's very clear, and we all know what's going on there, and in other Northern African countries, obviously, as well. And when faced with some attempts to implement equality proposals, many of the European People's Party, not just the hard right, are denouncing that these equality measures are somehow a way to try to deny Europe's Christian roots. So the myth of a Christian and white Europe is still common ground for many conservatives and radicals alike, right? And yet I think it is in the very field of equality that we can find some of the solutions here. Last year, Ursula von der Leyen promised to build, I quote, a Europe where it doesn't matter what you look like, who you love, how you pray, and where you are born. So for this not to be just lip service, basically what we need is a new and powerful anti-racism narrative, and actually appointing a new European Union Equality Commissioner who had a very strong mandate. So I think part of the pro-equality, and we talked about this yesterday, and pro-integration policies must follow as a part of a way to face the hard right. I think that in terms of it has to be sort of solidarity-based approach towards immigration. So actually, the opposite. The emphasis, and I go back to the very beginning of the lecture. The emphasis, I think, should be on equality and solidarity. So that political and social equality that's essentially denied, that we mentioned, that is somehow exchanged in favor of that national equality that we talk about at the beginning of the lecture. So in his book, The Far Right Today, Casmude wrote that the ultimate goal of all responses to the far right should be the strengthening of liberal democracy. And here my colleague Stephen Forti, in his Extrema Derecha 2.0, proposed a number of measures that included the establishment of a cordon sanitaire to prevent the far right from taking over the institutions, and a swift as well response, swift sanctions of the European Union against those member states who acted against the rule of law and did not respect human rights. In my view, and if the analysis of the past is of any use, the emphasis should be on that political equality, human rights, and solidarity to promote a welfare state nationalism that could actually fit with the European Union, with the European project, where it doesn't matter what you look like, who you love, how you pray, and where you are born. If the analysis of the connections of the radical right and the moderate right in the past teaches us something or anything, it is that adopting anti-democratic and xenophobic policies mainly benefits the far right and harms the democratic national community. So when social democrats, when conservatives try to placate the hard right by implementing some of their policies, they're not only accepting anti-democratic and dehumanizing policies, but dehumanizing their very national community. 100 years ago, after the establishment of the first interwar dictatorships, now, I mean, 100 years after the establishment of the first interwar dictatorship, Europe is witnessing a new rise of the far right. So history does not repeat itself, either as a force or as a tragedy, and the world in which we live is very different, obviously, from that time. But the experience of interwar Europe should serve as a warning against those nationalists who demonize enemies of the nation, show contempt for democracy and social justice, and offer simple solutions to complex problems.
Many thanks, Alex, and also for the time, because really 45 minutes. So we have around 30 minutes to question, to have a debate. So please feel free to make some question. I have here, there, and there. Yeah.
It's on? Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Alejandro Quiroga for magnificent speak he did, and to congratulate him for mentioning the myth of the Italian as victims of the Nazism. Italians brava gente, Italiani brava gente, that we all the Italians know perfectly. I'd just like to say that just it was until the late 90s when finally Italian war crimes started to be scientifically researched and studied. I'd like to just give a personal, a small contribution to another thing you said in your conference. You mentioned the erosion of the anti-fascist narrative, especially in Italy, in Austria as well. Well, I'd like to give just a small and personal contribution about it. Actually, nowadays I'm the president of the Spanish section of the Associazione Nazionale Partigiani d'Italia, ANPI, the National Association of Italian Partisans. We have a small section here in Spain. And the ANPI in Italy is still the biggest anti-fascist association, and not just in Italy, in Europe we have like 150,000 members, makes I think the biggest in Europe of these associations. In the last years, I just got in touch with the leaders of most of the leaders of this huge association, and I realized one thing, and that probably can explain us why this erosion of anti-fascist narrative is taking part. Well, their speeches, their minds are still Cold War minds and Cold War speeches. And I think that until we can't understand that the world changed, and the world is in the year 2024, is not the world in the year 1975, well, this anti-fascist narrative can't go on like this and should be rebuilt, starting from, I think, even the most important anti-fascist associations. And I just want to give this small contribution because I perfectly agree 100% about this idea of erosion that I see every day. Thank you.
Thanks, Alberto Pellegrini. I think we can like have 3 or 4 interventions. I saw some hand, and then Alex, you can make like one answer altogether. So we have Camille there, then or well, Natalie, if you want, yeah, please, and then Camille. Is it on? I think yeah. Try to talk. Try? No? Ah, well, we have here another micro.
No problem.
No? Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's better, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much for the lecture, which I can rely to because I used to work on the interwar period too, and I'm an historian, so I understand perfectly your perspective. And I work on the German case, so I am confronted to these comparisons in the news or in every day. So maybe 2 remarks or questions. I say maybe we should not overestimate the strength, how strong this anti-fascist narrative has been. Even in case of Germany, it seems obvious, centrality of Holocaust and never again, and so it's for at the level of the state, at the state level, it was clear. But when we look at the society, we had to wait until the 80s, until really the Holocaust has been recognized a central break in the history of Germany. And maybe it can explain how it can erode, even in Germany today. I will talk about this later. And the second remark is about the similarities to the 20s. It was addressed yesterday. Maybe it was a time of crisis, as you said, but also I think changing configuration. It was addressed yesterday that the people were confronted to a lot of changes, not only political but also cultural, socio-economic. I think the industry and the it was something that the German historians underlines. It was at the end of the 80s that it was a time of the Dominique Peukert, a crisis of the classic modernity, and it was particularly brutal in Germany because industrialization began later, and that these changes and then added to the end of the First World War, Versailles Treaty, and it was particularly brutal. And I think today we have this similarity with the people confronted to a lot of changes, globalization, and also war and economic crisis, I would say since 2008-9, and maybe just it can explain also this fear. There was a lot of lot. Yesterday they talk a lot about fear, and I think there could be a similarity. That doesn't mean that history repeats itself, but that explains this emotional reaction and this counter-reaction, because when brutal changes happen, a lot of people, and that's a natural reaction, tend to fear that some things might change and that they can't adjust this to this. It was just reflections.
Thanks, Natalie. We have here Camille and then Katalin.
No, thank you for a fantastic lecture. So, when it comes to differences, it strikes me that one of the biggest differences, yet we don't know exactly what will happen, but one of the biggest differences touches on the question of violence. To give only one example, if you take Eastern Europe, the Iron Guard, but the examples can be multiplied. I mean, the Iron Guard of the far-right movement had institutionalized organizations of people who were shooting other people, right? Mm-hmm. So, of course, Mariano Rajoy's health reform law does generate violence, but is not, and that's important to keep into mind, violence towards foreigners. I mean, violence is a very delicate concept with different facets, but that type of violence of the Iron Guard, we don't have it yet. So I think that's one of the key differences. The second one, you mentioned religion in passing, and this appeal to a civilizational discourse. But I wanted to ask you, I'm not a historian, whether actually there are not some substantive differences also in the usages of violence by the fascists in the interior period, much more substantive, as opposed to a more diluted, more strategic, not really appealing to faith and to a closed organic community, as we have nowadays, from Orban to whatever, to Vox and so on and so forth. And the third one, when it comes to the constructive part, and I finish this, it strikes me that you who are an expert in nationalism, when you speak about what should you do in terms of a counter-narrative, you actually don't deal with nationalism. And I think that a counter-narrative that doesn't try to co-opt somehow key topoi of the nationalist discourse, right? I'm not referring to normalization of some bad stuff, but I think we need a counter-narrative that deals with the question of nationalism and the central importance of nation for people. If you just appeal to some cosmopolitan topoi, as much as I love them as well, solidarity and so on and so forth, we'll just lose, right? So I think that nationalism, in some way or another, I don't know exactly how, should be central to a counter-narrative.
Alex, you want maybe to answer, and then we make a,
Probably so. Okay, thank you for the questions. I'm looking for something, so please give me 30 seconds. Yes, okay, got it. All right. In terms of the anti-fascist narratives, I mean, obviously, and I touch upon both questions. They change over time, and it's not the same. You know, whatever is built in the late 40s, especially in the case of Germany, but throughout, you know, those constitutional periods, in particular, and then how they change, and they change over the 60s, obviously, and over the 70s. So it's you know, the changes continuously, but. I think, generally speaking, what happened, the turning point was 1989, that led to sort of a reevaluation, or the post-1989, of those anti-fascist narratives in a manner that had not been done before. So that was, and that manner was not that much like fascism is fine, but it was, in many cases, an attempt to move forward. And I'm going to read to you, this is what I was looking for, the comments by Gianfranco Fini, the at the time leader of Alleanza Nazionale, months before he entered the Berlusconi government for the first time. And he said, "I was born in 1952. I am a post-fascist, and I hope that Italy stops talking about fascism and anti-fascism." So the idea was not fascism is fine, but let's move forward. Let's forget about this. So, and that is a strategy, right? And I think nowadays, for the hard right, if you they can be openly anti-fascist in the sort of more classic sense, like the British far right. The anti-fascist myth still central in terms of building the national community.
In the same interview, Fini also stated that Mussolini was the greater statist in the war. So it's like, to reivindicate, but not maybe explicitly, and at the same time, okay, let's talk about other things now, no?
Because, and that happened as well in the idea of guilt in the case of Germany as well, and that was generational, and as well, there were changes there as well. But Germany, nevertheless, is probably the most difficult case, because it's the most difficult case to defascisticize. That one doesn't get more fascist than a Nazi. I mean, you could, but and as well because popular resistance was crash and wasn't very big. So initially, but not during the Second World War. So in that sense, I think the German case. It's a bit more difficult to build an anti-fascist rhetoric that it goes through the fascistization. So the rhetoric has to be built, and as it was, in sort of the never again that you were building. So that, in a way, makes sense. As for the idea of fear, I would agree that it's very important. But fear can operate at many different levels, and it doesn't. I think sometimes you could explain reactionary hard right positions in terms of fear, but not necessarily. I mean, you can move towards other sort of positions, and I think nowadays the role of fear, I think, is important. It's probably related to more insecurity than the actual fear of a complete change. And I think it has changed, and it has changed because, and I link this with the third question, in many ways because of the use of violence. And you're absolutely right. I mean, there's no comparison with the level of political violence in the 1930s, in Romania, in the 1920s, in Italy, in Germany, of course, in Spain. So in that sense, obviously we are in a different planet, and there are institutionalized forms of violence, but we don't witness violence in the streets in the manner that we used to, as well because nowadays in Europe at least, United States, the state is so powerful that no one could actually challenge this. When in the 1930s and 1920s, there were more. So in that sense, it's very, very clear. The use of religion is, I was referring in particular to the idea of a Christian Europe that comes every now and then. That is not necessarily related to institutional churches. And 2 days ago, no, it was yesterday, the Spanish Catholic Church, so the hierarchy of the church, which usually has a very sort of conservative approach to many things, was actually issued a statement asking for compassion with immigrants and trying to integrate immigrants. So in many respects, sometimes I think in the 1920s and the 1930s, because of revolution, institutionally the Christian churches, but in particular the Catholic Church, was fairly happy to support the hard right and as well fascist movements, and that sort of integration with Christianity and fascism has been studied for years. Nowadays, I think the picture is a bit different. But what is, I think, is relevant is the use of Christianity as the myth of the origins of Europe, rather than more institutional. And finally, yes, nationalism has to be in the equation. I would agree. Actually, what I was saying is that perhaps I'm not saying that, I'm not sure whether nationalism, but a certain national identity based on the social patriotism, on the idea that the community, the national community, actually works towards equality and towards an idea of we redistribute. An idea of solidarity. I do think it could work in that way, but it has to work nowadays, I think, together with the European Union. So you can create that solidarity at European Union level. I know it's very difficult, but it's one of the principles of the European Union.
Katalin, and then Jure, I think. Yeah, and.
Thank you for this fascinating talk. I have a very short question. You started it with the populist leader. You defined it very well, and I could more than agree. And you started with the interwar period. Now, interwar period is a context, right? It is a post-war context. It is a disaster, socially, economically. It is a colonial context that is trembling. It is, empires are gone. So there is also insecurity in the context. Now my question is that how from one historian to another, how would you describe the significance of the temporal and spatial context regarding the rise of populist leaders and the rise of populist narratives? So my question is that is the context that is creating this kind of narratives, and there is this call for certain kind of leaders, or the other way around? So somebody has invented a certain kind of narrative that creates a kind of different context.
Katalin, thanks. There's Jure, and then you go there.
Thanks for your excellent lecture. I really enjoyed it. I'm also an interwar historian initially, so I really liked the structure of your presentation and the disclaimer. People 100 years ago were from another planet. We should be aware of that fact. First, a short comment also regarding Natalie's question on the importance of the anti-fascist narrative. You mentioned ex-Yugoslavia, Ustaša movement. Well, I would agree with Natalie, but not because of the so minimal importance of the anti-fascist narrative, but because of so great importance of the anti-fascist narrative in the ex-Yugoslavia until 1989. I would say that anti-fascist narrative today is under attack mostly in Croatia and in Serbia, precisely because it was so important in the socialist times. And I would say that this is only more or less a side effect that even overestimated the importance of the anti-fascist narrative. Of course, it's under attack. It should be, because it fits into the bigger picture, not because it's so central. It's only, let's say, a working thesis. But I thought of one more similarity, one more element, and I would wonder what you think about it. The concept of the state capture, it happened in the 1920s, and it's happening right now. For example, in Hungary, what do? Far-right parties. First, they attack the institutions. They say that they're not doing their job, that we should somehow restructure them. And when they seize power, or when they enter government, then they step by step diminish or even put them out of the power, the institutions of the liberal state. And we know that the concept of the liberal democracy of the state, liberal democratic state, is built on the independent institutions.
Thanks, Jure. There's another question here.
Yes, well, I think that also another difference that, sorry, also another difference maybe today is that we have much more far-right political parties that in the past, such as in the European Union, and the enemy may, well, the enemy, like, it may be difficult, like, to target them, and they use, like, confusionist politics, and it's quite hard, like, to identify them. And my question would be, like, when you were saying, like, populist, hard right, and like, how would you, sorry, I lost a bit the
Well, maybe
Yeah,
meanwhile
sorry.
you are talking about that. I
Sorry,
also
sorry,
ask something to Alex, and I think then we can close because we have around 10 minutes more, and then we have a coffee break. I think you touch a lot of very interesting point, no? And I agree with your analysis. First of all, and like to talk about then and now. In the 20s, you explained quite well, there was the so-called authoritarian compromise between like the conservative or traditional elite and the new fascist movement. Can we see something similar nowadays? I want to say, not talking about fascist movement, but far right and conservative elite or traditional elite. There's like, well, a comparison that we can see or some points in common. I think is interesting, linking with like the radicalization of the conservative in the last 20 years, more or less, no, and the normalization of the far right narratives. And then the second point that I think is really interesting. You talk about the policies of cruelty, no, and the dehumanization. That I think is really interesting, trying also to analyze extremist narratives, because here the point is that maybe it's a provocation what I'm saying, but is we should maybe consider neoliberalism or some part or some declination of neoliberalism as an extremist narratives, because when nowadays we are talking about extremist narratives, usually we are talking about racism, xenophobia, machism, etc., etc., etc. But maybe taking in account the example you put, should we maybe try to think or consider neoliberalism or some consequences of the neoliberal narratives as an extremist narratives? Is a provocation? Yeah, maybe yes or maybe not. I think it's something that we can talk about. I don't know finally if you now remember the question, so don't worry. Alex, the floor is yours, and then in 8-10 minutes we can have a break.
Okay. All right. Well, whether the context define reality, or that is actually defined by discourse. I mean, how long do you have? I mean, really, it's.
The question is that if we have a similar type of context, do we expect a similar kind of reaction, like coming up certain kind of leaders, coming up certain kind of discourses? This is the question.
Okay.
So is it the context making it, or these things are making the context?
Okay,
That's
but yeah, but we you mean the context in the 1920s and 30s?
Anytime.
Okay, well,
The
yeah.
context and the reaction, or this is the engine of the context.
Okay, it's a bit of a chicken and egg question, and I would imagine that I think that the discourse and policies they create new context, but then at least the origin of that those discourses and those policies are actually framed by the original context, meaning that we'll have to. I mean, you asked me a very historian question. I'm going to answer in a. As a historian, I think we will have to look at any particular case to rather than trying to probably. But then obviously we have to be able to explain and to draw lines and to tell what is relevant. So I would imagine that. In the case of the 1920s and the leadership, the kind of leadership of the 1920s, I think in many respects, I'm thinking about Horthy, Pilsudski, Primo de Rivera, Mussolini in some respects, they created new realities out of particular discourses that were more essentially rhetorical than the actual changes, at least in the 20s, in terms of socioeconomic structures. But obviously, we have to look very, very closely at different cases. About the idea of capturing the state. Yes, it's last night we were actually talking about how anti-European Union were the far-right parties and how they actually change once they get into power, because they realize that the European Union is this massive and fairly wealthy institution, and they may have these ideas about coming out of the European Union, but then usually say, well, maybe it's not that bad, and they change or adapt. And I think the key here in the case of, you mentioned Hungary, but probably as well the case of Poland with the PIS has been quite similar in the sense of using state resources to create a clientele, a political clientele that usually sort of reinforces itself, and it works pretty well. And the way, in some cases, the way the state is captured, it reminds me. I mean, it probably is not a fair comparison, but it reminds me a little bit to the Hungarian Communist Party in 47-48, when they actually capture the state with what they call the salami tactic. So getting part of of different ministries and different positions in government, and then eventually taking over the entire. And I think in the case of the PIS in Poland, when they took government, they colonized different ministries, and eventually ended up there. And the case of Orban as well is different, but I think because Orban himself and Fidesz, his party changed over time. He started as a conservative and ended up in the hard right, but initially it was something different. What you mentioned about the different parties in nowadays and interwar Europe, there were a lot of far-right parties in interwar Europe, and many of them would never say that they were fascist. Actually, probably one of the features of almost every single fascist party in Europe, with the exception of the Italian fascists, were to say that they were not fascist. Now, they might take some ideas, whatever, but they were not. And nowadays, the many parties that would not define themselves as far right, hard right, they wouldn't have a problem there. A different thing is that if they act, if their policies look like, if they their scores is hard right, they may be hard right in the end. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. They are. Yeah, their logic, but that happened, for instance, when in the early 1930s, there were some attempts to create a fascist international, and Mussolini was actually against it. Mm. Yeah, so that there are a number of, and it doesn't mean that that they can act together. But the policies, the discourse is quite similar, and it's always nationalist, nativist discourse, and the policies that they implement. And I think policies are important here. They actually go in that direction. Now, is neoliberalism an extremist? I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends what sort of, probably the Chicago boys sort of neoliberalism is quite extreme. And certainly, I don't know, some of the austerity measures that were taken were very, very extreme. I don't know. And it was very radical, I would say. But at the same time, it's become, especially after the 2008 economic crisis, it has become so hegemonic in Gramscian terms that I'm not sure whether if you're really, really, really hegemonic, you can be extremist.
I think that's the point, no?
Yeah, it could be. Could be like, I mean, honestly, I would have to think a bit longer for a proper answer. But it's become more hegemonic, I think, than it was before the crisis, and the recipes to come out of the crisis were in many cases brutal, as in dehumanizing. So in that sense, we're very, very radical. Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Alejandro. I think we can stop and have a break. We come back in exactly 25 minutes for the roundtable Extremist Narratives and Nation. Thanks.